when heaven chose a carpenter. Chapter 1. The Craftsman of Nazareth. Nazareth was the sort of place you only found if you were already lost. From a distance, it looked like a handful of houses a careless giant had dropped on the side of a hill. Mud brick walls, flat roofs, a few fig trees trying their best in stubborn soil. The road that wound past the village did not quite bother to enter it, as though even Roman stones had better things to do. Travellers passed by on their way to Sepphoris or Cana, and if they glanced up at all, it was only to confirm that yes, this was still Galilee, and no, there was nothing here worth stopping for. But for Joseph, son of Jacob, son of Mathan, son of David's ancient and unimpressive line, Nazareth was home, and home was enough. His workshop sat at the edge of the village, a low stone building that smelled perpetually of cedar shavings and sweat. The door hung slightly crooked. He'd been meaning to fix it for months, but the benches inside were solid, the tools sharp, and the work honest. Joseph made ploughs that bit deep into Galilean clay, yokes that sat square on oxen's shoulders, roof beams that didn't sag under winter rains. He was not an artist, he was a craftsman. There was a difference, and he knew it, and it didn't bother him. Most days, anyway. This particular morning the sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when Joseph found himself standing in the doorway, a plane in one hand and a half-finished door frame leaning against the wall behind him. He wasn't working, he was thinking about Mary, Mary, daughter of Joachim, Mary of the quick smile and the quieter eyes, Mary, who somehow managed to carry water jars on her head without looking like she was balancing the weight of the world, even though everyone knew she was. Betrothed to him, his. The word still felt too big in his mouth. He'd known her since they were children, of course. Nazareth was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and their families had been friendly in that vague, respectful way that families were when they shared a well and a synagogue and not much else. But it wasn't until 2 years ago, when she'd returned from visiting her cousin Elizabeth in Judea, taller and somehow more present than when she'd left, that Joseph had really seen her. Not just her face, though that was lovely enough. It was the way she listened when old Miriam told the same story for the 100th time. The way she sang the Psalms at Sabbath with her whole heart, like she actually believed God was listening. The way she looked at the world as though it was still new, still worth marvelling at, even in a place like Nazareth, where nothing ever happened. Joseph had gone to his father and asked permission to approach her family. His father had raised an eyebrow. Mary? Really? But hadn't objected. The betrothal contract had been signed 6 months ago. In another 6 months, maybe less, she would come to live in his house. He would be her husband. She would be his wife. The thought made his chest feel tight and warm at the same time, like standing too close to a fire on a cold night. He set the plane down on the workbench and ran a hand through his hair, which was already dusty despite the early hour. He had work to do, a cartwheel to repair for Eli the farmer, a table to finish for the synagogue, a door frame, this door frame, the one he'd been staring at for 10 minutes, for the small room he was adding to his house, for Mary. He picked up the plane again and got to work. The rhythm of it steadied him, as it always did, the bite of the blade into wood, the curl of the shaving peeling away, the grain revealing itself, line by patient line. There was something almost holy about it, though Joseph would never have said so out loud. But when he worked, when his hands were busy and his mind could settle, he felt close to something larger than himself. The God who had made the cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan had also made the hands that shaped them. Joseph liked to think that counted for something. His father had taught him the trade, as his father's father had taught him. The tools Joseph used now, some of them anyway, had been his grandfather's. The adze with the worn handle, the bow drill with the frayed string he kept meaning to replace. They were old, but they worked, and there was a kind of comfort in that, a kind of continuity. He was part of something that stretched back further than he could see, and would stretch forward further than he would live to know. It was a small life, he supposed, but it was a good one. By mid-morning, the heat had begun to settle into the workshop like an unwelcome guest. Joseph wiped his brow with the back of his hand and stepped outside for air. The village was awake now. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children shouted somewhere near the well. A donkey brayed, annoyed at something only donkeys understood. And then he saw her. Mary. She was walking up the narrow path from the well, a water jar balanced on her shoulder, her mother beside her. Even from a distance, even with her face half shadowed by her headscarf, Joseph knew her. The way she moved, the way she held herself, like she was carrying something precious and didn't want to spill a drop. His heart did something complicated in his chest. She'd been gone for 3 months. 3 months visiting her cousin Elizabeth in the hill country of Judea. Elizabeth, who was old and had never had children, and whose husband Zechariah was a priest in the temple. Joseph didn't know all the details. Mary's mother had mentioned something about Elizabeth finally being with child, which seemed impossible, but also exactly the sort of thing God did when he wanted to remind people he was still paying attention. Joseph had missed her. He hadn't realized how much until just now, seeing her again. He wanted to go to her, to welcome her home, to ask if the journey had been hard, if Elizabeth was well, if she'd missed Nazareth, if she'd missed him. But he didn't. Not yet. There were proprieties. They weren't married yet. People talked, and in a village like Nazareth, talk was the only entertainment anyone had. So instead, Joseph stood in the doorway of his workshop and watched her for a moment longer, letting himself feel the simple, uncomplicated gladness of knowing she was near again. She glanced up, just for a moment, and their eyes met. She smiled. It was a small smile, quiet, but it was for him, and that was enough. Joseph smiled back, raised a hand in greeting, and then, because he didn't trust himself to do anything else without looking like a fool, he turned and went back inside. The rest of the day passed in the usual way. Work, sweat, the slow, steady progress of wood becoming something useful. Eli came by to pick up his cartwheel and paid in grain, which Joseph accepted with a nod. The synagogue leader stopped in to check on the table and seemed satisfied, though he made a point of running his hand along the edge, as if searching for imperfections. Joseph let him. The work would speak for itself. By the time the sun began to sink toward the western hills, Joseph's back ached and his hands were sore, but the doorframe was finished. He stood back and looked at it, turning it this way and that in the fading light. Solid, square, no gaps, no wobble, it would do. He set it carefully against the wall and began to clean up, sweeping shavings into a pile, wiping down tools, banking the small fire he kept for heating glue. The workshop grew dim. Outside, the village settled into evening. Lamps were lit, voices softened. Somewhere, a mother called her children home. Joseph stepped outside and looked up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, faint and far away. He knew their names, his father had taught him, and he knew the stories that went with them. The stories of Abraham, who had been promised descendants as numerous as the stars. The stories of David, the shepherd king, who had looked up at these same lights and written songs about the God who made them. Joseph was no king. He was no prophet. He was just a carpenter in a nothing village on the edge of the empire, trying to make an honest living and build a life with a girl he loved. But he believed in the God of Abraham, the God of David, the God who had made the stars and the cedars and the hands that shaped them. And he believed quietly, without fanfare, in the way that steady men believe, that God saw him, that his life, small as it was, mattered. He didn't know, standing there in the gathering dark, that he was right. He didn't know that in a few short days, everything he thought he understood about his life, about Mary, about God himself, would be turned inside out. He didn't know that the God who had made the stars was about to ask him to do something impossible. All he knew was that Mary was home, the work was good, and tomorrow he would begin building the room where they would start their life together. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Chapter 2. A shocking confession. The evening Mary came to find him, Joseph was finishing the doorframe. He'd been working on it all week, stealing hours between other jobs, sanding the joints smooth. checking the angles with the care of a man building something that mattered. The room was nearly ready now. New walls, a small window cut into the eastern side so the morning light would come in. A place for them to sleep, a place to begin. He didn't hear her approach. The workshop was loud with the sound of his own work. The rasp of the plane, the scrape of the chisel, the small satisfying sounds of wood being shaped into something true. It wasn't until she spoke that he realized he wasn't alone. Joseph. He turned and there she was in the doorway, silhouetted against the last light of the day. Mary. But something was different. Something in the way she stood, the way she held herself, like she was carrying something heavier than a water jar. Mary. He set down his tools, wiping his hands on his tunic. I didn't expect. Are you well? Is your mother? I'm well. She stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind her. The workshop grew dimmer. I needed to speak with you. Alone? Joseph's stomach did something complicated. They were betrothed, yes, but they didn't meet alone. Not in Nazareth. Not where people could see. There were proprieties, boundaries drawn by custom and law, and the simple fact that a man and woman who weren't yet married didn't give the village anything to talk about. But Mary had come anyway. Of course, sir, he said, and he gestured to the bench. Sit, please. She didn't sit. Instead, she walked to the window, the one he'd cut for their room, and looked out at the darkening hills. Her hands were clasped in front of her, so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. I've been away, she said quietly, 3 months in Judea, with my cousin Elizabeth. Yes, I know. Your mother mentioned. I need to tell you what happened there. She turned to face him, and in the fading light, Joseph could see that her eyes were red. She'd been crying. I need to tell you before anyone else does, before the whispers start, before you hear it from someone in the village. Joseph's mouth had gone dry. Mary, what are you talking about? She took a breath, a long one, like she was gathering courage the way a diver gathers breath before plunging into deep water. I'm with child, she said. The words hung in the air between them, like stones dropped into still water, sending out ripples that seemed to touch everything. Joseph didn't move, didn't speak, couldn't for a moment seem to remember how. I know what it looks like, Mary continued, her voice steady now, though her hands were still shaking. I know what everyone will say. I know what you're thinking. But Joseph, you have to listen to me. You have to believe me. The child, he's not... I haven't... Mary, his voice came out rough. How long? 3 months. Maybe a little more. I didn't know at first. I thought it was just the travel, the strangeness of being away from home. But then Elizabeth, my cousin, she knew. She said the baby moved inside her, and she knew. And she looked at me, and she knew. Joseph turned away. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see her face, her eyes, the desperate hope that he would somehow understand, would somehow accept this. There's more, Mary said behind him. In Judea, Joseph, an angel came to me. He closed his eyes. An angel, she continued, and now there was something almost defiant in her voice, like she knew how insane it sounded and was determined to say it anyway. His name was Gabriel. He told me I had found favour with God. He told me I would conceive and bear a son, and I would call his name Jesus. He said the child would be great, and would be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God would give to him the throne of his father David, and he would reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there would be no end. Joseph opened his eyes. He still couldn't turn around. I asked him how this could be, Mary said, because I'm a virgin, and he said, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. The words were from Scripture. Joseph recognized them, or something like them, the language of prophecy, the language of the impossible. Mary, he said, and his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone older, someone broken. Do you understand what you're asking me to believe? Yes. Do you understand what will happen if you're wrong? If this is... He couldn't finish, couldn't say the word. Madness, delusion, or worse. I'm not wrong, Mary said quietly, and I'm not asking you to believe me because it makes sense. I'm asking you to believe me because you know me, because you know I wouldn't lie about this, because... Her voice cracked. Because I love you, and I'm terrified, and I need you to stand with me. Joseph finally turned around. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. But she held his gaze, and he could see it in her eyes. The fear, yes, but also something else. A kind of certainty, a kind of peace underneath the terror, like she'd already made her peace with the impossible and was now waiting to see if he could do the same. An angel, he said flatly. Yes. Came to you. Yes. And told you that you would bear the Son of God. Yes. Joseph walked to the workbench and sat down heavily on the stool. His hands were shaking now too. He looked at them as though they belonged to someone else. Steady hands. Carpenter's hands. Hands that knew how to build things, to make them solid and true. Hands that had no idea how to hold something like this. My father will know, he said. Your father will know. The whole village will know within a week. Within days, probably. I know. They'll say you're... He couldn't say it. Couldn't name the shame that would attach itself to her name, like a stain that would never wash out. They'll say terrible things. I know. The law... Joseph's voice was barely a whisper now. Mary, the law says... I know what the law says. She moved closer, and he could smell the dust of the road on her, the scent of travel and fear, and something else he couldn't name. I know what it says about women who lie with men before marriage. I know what it says about stoning. I know all of it, Joseph. And I'm still here. I'm still telling you the truth. Joseph put his head in his hands. He wanted to pray. He wanted to rage. He wanted to wake up and discover this was all a dream. That Mary was still in Judea. That his life was still simple and ordered and made sense. But she was here. And she was pregnant. And she was telling him that an angel had done it. Why? He asked, looking up at her. Why you? Why now? Why? He gestured helplessly at the room he'd been building, at the life they'd been planning. Why would God do this to you, to us? I don't know, Mary said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice, like she'd already asked herself this question 1,000 times and had learned to live with the not knowing. I just know that when the angel told me, I said yes. I said, Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. And then it happened. Joseph stood up. He needed to move, needed to do something with the chaos that was churning inside him. He walked to the window, their window, the one he'd cut so carefully, and looked out at Nazareth. The village was settling into evening. Lamps were being lit. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a dog barked. Everything was normal. Everything was ordinary. Everything was about to change. I can't, he said quietly. Mary, I can't. I don't know how to... I'm not asking you to understand it, she said. I'm asking you to trust me, to trust God. Trust God? He turned to face her, and there was something almost wild in his eyes now. Mary, do you know what you're asking? If I take you as my wife now, if I claim this child as mine, everyone will think, everyone will know, that I've lain with you before marriage. My reputation will be destroyed. Your reputation is already destroyed. And the child, his voice broke, the child will grow up knowing that everyone in this village thinks he's a bastard. Yes, Mary said simply. I know. And you're asking me to do that anyway. No, she said. I'm not asking you to do anything. I came here to tell you the truth. What you do with it, that's between you and God. She moved toward the door. Joseph watched her, unable to move, unable to speak. She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the last light of the day, and for a moment she looked impossibly young and impossibly strong at the same time. I love you, Joseph, she said. I will always love you, but I can't ask you to believe something you can't believe. I can only tell you what happened to me, and trust that God will do what he needs to do. And then she was gone, leaving Joseph alone in the workshop, with the half-finished doorframe and the wreckage of everything he'd thought his life would be. He didn't go home that night. He stayed in the workshop, sitting on the bench, staring at nothing. The darkness deepened, the stars came out. Somewhere in the village, the evening prayers were being said. Somewhere, people were settling into sleep, their lives still ordered, still making sense. Joseph's didn't make sense anymore. He thought about Mary, about the way she'd looked at him when she told him about the angel, about the certainty in her voice. She wasn't lying. He knew her well enough to know that. Mary didn't lie. Mary didn't imagine things. Mary was the most grounded, the most real person he knew, which meant either she was mad or she was telling the truth. And if she was telling the truth, then everything Joseph believed about the world, about how it worked, about what was possible, about the nature of God himself, was wrong. He thought about the law, about what it demanded, about what a righteous man was supposed to do when faced with a woman who claimed to be pregnant with another man's child. The answer was clear. The answer had always been clear. A righteous man upheld the law. A righteous man didn't compromise. A righteous man didn't let his heart override his duty. But Joseph's heart was breaking. He thought about the child, about the life growing inside Mary, innocent, blameless. And yet if Joseph did what the law demanded, that child would die. Mary would die, and Joseph would be the one who killed them. How was that righteous? How was that anything but murder? He put his head in his hands and wept, not quietly, not with restraint, but with the deep wrenching sobs of a man whose entire world had just collapsed, and who had no idea how to build it back up again. The workshop was silent except for the sound of his grief. Outside, Nazareth slept. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and Joseph sat alone in the darkness, a righteous man with no idea how to be righteous anymore, holding the weight of an impossible choice. By morning, he had made his decision. He would divorce her, quietly, privately. He would write out the bill of divorcement and give it to her, and he would do it in such a way that no one would know the truth. No one would know that she'd been unfaithful. No one would know that Joseph had discovered her shame. As far as the village would know, Joseph had simply decided the betrothal wasn't suitable. It happened sometimes. It was no one's business but theirs. It would save her life. It would destroy his own, but it would save hers. And that, Joseph thought, as the first light of dawn crept through the workshop window, was all that mattered. He was a righteous man, and a righteous man protected the innocent, even if it cost him everything. Even if it meant giving up the only woman he'd ever loved. Even if it meant living the rest of his life, knowing that he'd turned away from something miraculous because he was too afraid, too small, too human to believe it could be real. Joseph picked up his tools and went back to work. The doorframe still needed finishing. The room still needed to be completed. He would do it anyway. He would build it, and then he would give it to someone else. Some other man would sleep in that room with some other woman, and they would have children, and they would live the ordinary, ordered life that Joseph had wanted so badly. And Joseph would be alone. He picked up the plane and began to work, his hands moving through the familiar motions, even as his heart shattered into pieces too small to ever fit back together again. Chapter 3. A Righteous Man in the Dark. The night stretched on forever. Joseph lay on his mat in the small room behind the workshop, the one where he slept when work kept him late, or when the weather turned too cold for the walk home to his father's house. He wasn't sleeping. He hadn't slept since Mary left. His mind was a storm, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, saw the tears, saw the desperate hope that he would somehow understand, somehow believe, somehow say yes to the impossible. He'd made his decision. He knew what he had to do. The bill of divorcement was already written in his mind, word for word. He could compose it in the morning, have it witnessed, deliver it to her father. It would be done quietly, respectfully. No scandal, no shame, just a simple dissolution of the betrothal. The kind of thing that happened sometimes when two families realized they weren't suited after all. It would save her life. So why did it feel like he was dying? Joseph rolled onto his side, trying to find a position that didn't make his chest ache. The mat was thin, worn soft by years of use. Outside, the village was silent. Even the dogs had stopped barking. It was the deep part of the night, the part where the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for dawn. He thought about Mary, about the way she'd looked in the doorway of the workshop, silhouetted against the dying light, about the way her voice had sounded when she said, "I love you, Joseph. I will always love you." She'd meant it. He knew she had. And he loved her too. God knew he loved her. He loved her so much that it hurt to breathe sometimes. Loved her in a way that was quiet and steady and true. The kind of love that built things, that made plans, that looked toward the future with hope. And now that love was going to destroy her, unless he let her go. Joseph sat up, unable to lie still any longer. The darkness of the room pressed in on him. He could see the faint outline of his tools on the workbench, the shapes of wood waiting to be shaped. Everything in this room was solid. Everything was real. Everything made sense, except for Mary, except for what she'd told him, except for the angel that apparently existed in a world Joseph had thought he understood. He stood and walked to the window. The stars were still out, wheeling slowly across the sky. He knew their names. His father had taught him when he was a boy, pointing them out on nights like this, telling him the stories that went with them, the stories of Abraham, who had been promised descendants as numerous as the stars, the stories of David, the shepherd king, who had looked up at these same lights and written songs about the God who made them. Joseph had always believed those stories, had always believed that God was real, that he was present, that he cared about the small lives of small people in small villages. He'd believed it the way he believed in the solidity of wood, the sharpness of tools, the reliability of his own two hands. But he'd never believed that God would do something like this. He'd never believed that God would come down and touch a girl in Nazareth and ask her to bear his son. He'd never believed that God would ask him to be part of it. Joseph pressed his forehead against the cool stone of the window frame. The night air was cold. It helped, a little. It helped him think. What if Mary was telling the truth? That the thought came unbidden, unwelcome. Joseph tried to push it away, but it wouldn't go. It sat in his mind like a stone in his shoe, impossible to ignore. What if she was telling the truth? If she was, then everything Joseph thought he knew about the world was wrong. The laws of nature didn't work the way he thought they did. God didn't work the way he thought he did. The God Joseph had believed in was orderly, predictable, reasonable. The God Joseph had believed in didn't do things like this. But what if he did? What if the God of Abraham and David was exactly the kind of God who would do something impossible? Who would reach down and touch a young girl in a nothing village and ask her to bear the Messiah? Who would turn the world upside down, not with armies or proclamations, but with a baby in a manger? Joseph's hands were shaking. If Mary was telling the truth, then he was about to commit a terrible sin. He was about to divorce an innocent woman. He was about to reject the will of God. He was about to turn away from something miraculous, because he was too afraid, too small, too human to believe it could be real. But if she was lying, if she was mad, or if she'd been seduced by some man and was now constructing an elaborate fantasy to explain it away, then he would be a fool to believe her. He would be a fool to claim her child as his own. He would be a fool to destroy his reputation, his standing in the community, his entire life, for a lie. Joseph walked back to his mat and sat down heavily. His head was pounding. His heart was racing. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unable to see the bottom, unable to know if there was solid ground below or just empty air. What if he was wrong? What if he divorced her and then later discovered that she'd been telling the truth, that he'd rejected the will of God out of fear and doubt, that he'd condemned an innocent woman to death because he couldn't believe? But what if he was wrong the other way? What if he claimed her and then discovered that she'd lied, that he'd spent his entire life raising another man's bastard, that he'd made himself a laughingstock, that he'd thrown away his reputation and his future for a woman who'd deceived him? Joseph put his head in his hands. The questions were endless. They spiraled and twisted, each one leading to another, until he felt like he was drowning in them. He thought about the law, about what it said, about what a righteous man was supposed to do. If a man takes a wife and, after sleeping with her, dislikes her, and slanders her, and says, "I married this woman, but when I approached her, I did not find proof of her virginity," then the young woman's father and mother shall bring proof that she was a virgin to the town elders at the gate. The law was clear. The law was always clear. A woman who was not a virgin when she married was to be stoned. That was what the law said. That was what righteousness demanded. But Mary was a virgin, she'd told him so, and if she was telling the truth about the angel, then she was still a virgin. The child wasn't Joseph's, it wasn't any man's in the way that children usually came to be. So what did the law say about that? Joseph didn't know. He didn't think anyone knew, because no one had ever faced a situation like this before. No one had ever had to decide what righteousness meant when the situation was impossible. He thought about the righteous men he knew, his father, who was honest in his dealings and kept the law meticulously, the rabbi, who could quote scripture and explain the finer points of the law with precision, the elders of the village, who judged disputes and upheld the traditions of their fathers. What would they do if they were in his position? They would stone her. That's what they would do. They would uphold the law and they would stone her, and they would sleep soundly that night, knowing they'd done what was right. But Joseph couldn't do that. He couldn't even imagine it. The thought of Mary, standing before the village, stones in their hands, her blood on the ground, it made him feel like he was going to be sick. So he would divorce her instead, quietly, privately. He would save her life and he would destroy his own. And that would be the price of his mercy. That would be the price of his love. Joseph lay back down on the mat. The darkness pressed in on him. Outside, the night was still and silent. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The same stars that had looked down on Abraham and David, and all the righteous men who had come before. What would they have done? Abraham had believed God when God told him to leave his home and go to a land he'd never seen. Abraham had believed God when God told him he would have a son, even though his wife was barren and old. Abraham had believed God, and it had been counted to him as righteousness. But Abraham had also lied about his wife. Abraham had also made mistakes. Abraham had also struggled with faith. Joseph thought about that, about the fact that even the greatest men of faith had doubted, had questioned, had gotten it wrong sometimes. What if Joseph was supposed to believe Mary? What if that was his test, the way Abraham's test had been to leave his home, the way David's test had been to trust God even when he was hunted like an animal? What if Joseph's test was to believe something impossible? He lay in the darkness, his mind churning, his heart breaking, and he did something he hadn't done since Mary left the workshop. He prayed, not the formal prayers he said at the synagogue, not the words he'd learned as a child, but a raw, desperate cry from the depths of his being, the kind of prayer that didn't care about proper form or correct language. The kind of prayer that was just a man, alone in the dark, crying out to a God he wasn't sure was listening. God of Abraham, he whispered, God of David, God of my fathers, I don't understand. I don't know what to do. I don't know what's true and what's false. I don't know if Mary is telling me the truth, or if she's mad, or if I'm mad for even considering that she might be telling the truth. He paused, swallowing hard. I love her, he continued. I love her so much that it hurts. And I'm about to destroy her life because I'm too afraid to believe, because I'm too small to accept that you might do something like this, because I can't imagine that you would choose me, a carpenter in a nothing village, to be part of something so impossible. The darkness didn't answer. The stars didn't move. God didn't speak. But Joseph kept talking anyway. If she's telling the truth, he said, then I'm about to commit a terrible sin. I'm about to reject your will. I'm about to turn away from something miraculous because I don't have the faith to accept it. And if that's the case, then I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I don't know how to believe something like that. I don't know how to accept that an angel came to a girl in Judea and told her she would bear the Son of God. I don't know how to accept that somehow, impossibly, I'm supposed to be part of that story. He stopped. His throat was tight. His eyes were burning. And if she's lying, he whispered, then I'm about to make the kindest choice I can make. I'm about to save her life, even though it will cost me everything. Even though I'll spend the rest of my life alone, wondering what might have been. Even though everyone in this village will think I'm a fool for letting her go. Joseph rolled onto his side, curling into himself like a child. I don't know what to do, he said to the darkness, to the stars, to the God who might or might not be listening. I don't know how to be righteous anymore. I don't know how to choose between the law and mercy. I don't know how to choose between my love for Mary and my duty to God. I don't know how to choose between believing something impossible and protecting myself from being a fool. He lay there for a long time, waiting for an answer that didn't come. The night pressed in on him. The darkness was absolute, and Joseph, a righteous man, with no idea how to be righteous anymore, lay alone in the workshop and wept. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the window, he had made his decision. He would divorce her. Quietly, privately, he would write out the bill of divorcement and give it to her, and he would do it in such a way that no one would know the truth. No one would know that she'd been unfaithful. No one would know that Joseph had discovered her shame. As far as the village would know, Joseph had simply decided the betrothal wasn't suitable. It would save her life. It would destroy his own, but it would save hers. And that, Joseph thought, as he stood and began to prepare for the day, was all that mattered. That was the only choice a man who loved her could make. He was a righteous man, and a righteous man protected the innocent, even if it cost him everything. Even if it meant giving up the only woman he'd ever loved. Even if it meant living the rest of his life, knowing that he'd turned away from something miraculous because he was too afraid, too small, too human to believe it could be real. Joseph washed his face in the cold water from the well. He dressed in clean clothes. He prepared himself to do what had to be done. He didn't know that everything was about to change. He didn't know that the God he'd been crying out to in the darkness was about to answer him in a way he could never have imagined. He didn't know that by the time the sun set that day, his entire understanding of righteousness, of faith, of what it meant to say yes to God, would be transformed forever. All he knew was that he had to let Mary go. All he knew was that it was the kindest thing he could do. All he knew was that his heart was breaking, and he didn't know how to put it back together again. Chapter 4. Do not be afraid. The dream. Joseph didn't sleep that night either. He'd spent the day in a kind of numb fog, going through the motions of work without really being present. He'd repaired a plough for Eli, though he couldn't remember doing it. He'd worked on a table for the synagogue, his hands moving through the familiar motions, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark, somewhere broken. By evening, he'd made up his mind completely. The bill of divorcement was written in his head, word perfect. He would compose it properly tomorrow, have it witnessed, deliver it to Mary's father. It would be done. It would be over. Mary would be free, and Joseph would be alone. And that would be the way of things. He'd eaten nothing all day. His stomach was a knot of tension and grief. When darkness fell, he returned to the small room behind the workshop and lay down on his mat, knowing that sleep wouldn't come, knowing that he would spend another night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the weight of his decision. But exhaustion, it seemed, was more powerful than grief. He fell asleep almost immediately, his body finally surrendering to the need for rest, his mind shutting down the endless spiral of questions and doubts. For a few hours there was nothing. No thought, no pain, just the blessed emptiness of unconsciousness. And then the dream began. At first Joseph didn't realize he was dreaming. The workshop looked exactly as it always did. The same tools on the bench, the same wood shavings on the floor, the same stone walls, but there was a quality to it that was different, a kind of clarity that was almost too sharp, too real. The light was strange too, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, neither the light of day nor the light of lamps, but something else entirely. Joseph stood in the centre of the workshop, and he knew, the way you know things in dreams without being told, that he wasn't alone. The figure appeared gradually, as though materializing out of the light itself. At first, Joseph couldn't quite see him. Then the image sharpened, and Joseph found himself looking at a being of such terrible beauty that he couldn't breathe. The angel was tall, impossibly tall, his form seeming to shift and change even as Joseph looked at him. His face was both masculine and ageless, beautiful and terrible at once. His eyes held the light of 1,000 stars, and around him The air itself seemed to shimmer and burn with a presence so overwhelming that Joseph felt like he was being crushed beneath the weight of it. Fear seized Joseph's heart, not the small, manageable fear of everyday life, but a primal, all-consuming terror. The kind of fear that made you want to run, to hide, to cease to exist, rather than face what was in front of you. He fell to his knees. "Do not be afraid," the angel said. His voice was like nothing Joseph had ever heard. It was gentle and terrible at the same time, like the sound of wind and thunder, and the singing of stars all at once. It resonated in Joseph's chest, in his bones, in the very core of his being. "Do not be afraid," the angel repeated, and somehow, impossibly, Joseph found that he could breathe again. The terror didn't disappear entirely, but it receded, became manageable, became something he could live with. "I am Gabriel," the angel said. "I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you." Joseph couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only kneel there, trembling, waiting for whatever came next. "Joseph, son of David," Gabriel said, and the use of his name, his full name, the name that connected him to the ancient king, made something shift inside Joseph's chest. "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife." The words hung in the air. Joseph's mind struggled to process them. "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife." As though Joseph had been afraid. As though Joseph had been considering rejecting her. As though the angel knew exactly what Joseph had decided to do. "For that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit," Gabriel continued. "She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." The words were like scripture, like prophecy, like something that had been written into the fabric of the world since before time began. Joseph heard them, and something in him recognized them as true. Not because they made sense, they didn't make sense, they made no sense at all, but because they carried with them the weight of absolute truth, the kind of truth that couldn't be denied or questioned or reasoned away. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means, "God with us," Gabriel said, and Joseph recognized the words from Isaiah, from the prophecies he'd read in the synagogue, from the hopes of his people, stretching back centuries. God with us, Emmanuel. The child that Mary was carrying wasn't just a child, it was God. God coming down into the world, taking on flesh, becoming human. God choosing to be born to a young girl in Nazareth. God choosing to be raised by a carpenter. God choosing Joseph. "Joseph, son of David," Gabriel said again, and this time there was something almost tender in his voice. "You have been chosen, you have been called. The God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of David the king, has looked upon you and found you worthy. He is asking you to be the earthly father of his son. He is asking you to protect him, to raise him, to teach him the ways of righteousness. He is asking you to say yes." Joseph wanted to speak, wanted to ask questions, to voice his doubts, to explain why he couldn't possibly do this, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was kneel there, trembling, as the angel looked down at him with eyes that held the light of eternity. "Do not be afraid," Gabriel said, one more time, "for I am with you, and God is with you, and the child that Mary carries is God himself, coming to save his people from their sins. This is the promise of the prophets. This is the hope of Israel. And you, Joseph, son of David, have been chosen to be part of it." The light grew brighter. Joseph had to shield his eyes. The workshop began to fade, the walls becoming transparent, the floor dissolving beneath him. He was falling, or flying, or being lifted up into something vast and incomprehensible. The light was everywhere now, burning away everything he thought he knew, everything he thought he understood, everything he thought he was. And in that light, Joseph felt something he hadn't felt since Mary had told him about the angel. He felt peace. Not the absence of fear or doubt or confusion, but something deeper than that. A kind of certainty that transcended understanding. A knowledge that somehow, impossibly, everything was going to be all right. that God was real and present and in control, that the impossible was not only possible, but was actually happening right now, in this moment, in this village, in this life. Joseph felt loved, chosen, called. He felt like he mattered. He woke gasping, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. For a moment he lay on his mat, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but breathe. The dream was fading already, the way dreams do, but the feeling of it remained. The presence of the angel, the weight of the words, the absolute certainty that what he'd experienced was real. Not a dream, not a vision, real. Joseph sat up slowly. The room was dark, but it was the ordinary darkness of night, not the strange, burning light of the dream. Outside, the village was silent. It was still hours before dawn. He stood on shaking legs and walked to the window. The stars were still there, wheeling slowly across the sky. The same stars that had looked down on Abraham and David, the same stars that had looked down on Joseph his entire life. But everything was different now. Joseph understood with a clarity that transcended logic or reason that the dream had been real, that Gabriel had come to him, that the angel had spoken to him, that God had chosen him. And more than that, Joseph understood that Mary had been telling the truth. The child she was carrying was the Son of God, the Messiah, the one that the prophets had spoken of, the one that Israel had been waiting for centuries. And somehow, impossibly, that child was going to be born in Nazareth, to Mary, and Joseph was going to be his earthly father. Joseph sank to his knees beside the window. He wasn't crying now. He was past tears. He was in a state of shock, of awe, of a kind of wonder that was almost too large to contain in his human body. God, he whispered. God, I don't understand. I don't know how this is possible. I don't know how I'm supposed to do this. I'm just a carpenter. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. How can you ask me to do something like this? But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. God didn't ask people to do things because they were qualified. God didn't choose people because they were great or powerful or wise. God chose people because he loved them, because he had a purpose for them, because he saw something in them that they couldn't see in themselves. Joseph thought about Mary, about the way she'd looked at him in the workshop, about the certainty in her voice when she told him about the angel, about the way she'd said, "I love you, Joseph. I will always love you." She'd been telling the truth all along. And Joseph had been about to destroy her. The thought made him feel sick. He'd been so close to making a terrible mistake, so close to rejecting the will of God out of fear and doubt, so close to condemning an innocent woman to death because he couldn't believe. But God had intervened. God had sent Gabriel to him. God had given him the faith he needed to believe. Joseph stood up. He knew what he had to do now. He had to go to Mary. He had to tell her that he believed her, that he would take her as his wife, that he would raise the child as his own, that he would protect them both with his life. He had to say yes. But it was still hours before dawn. Mary would be asleep. Her family would be asleep. He couldn't go to her now. He would have to wait for morning. He would have to wait for the sun to rise. And then he would go to her, and he would tell her everything. Joseph returned to his mat, but he didn't lie down. He sat on the edge of it, his mind racing, his heart full of a joy and terror that was almost too much to bear. He thought about the child, about what it would mean to raise the Son of God, about the responsibility, the weight, the impossible task that God had set before him. He thought about the future, about the life that was coming, about all the ways that this was going to be hard, all the ways that people would judge them, all the ways that Joseph would have to be strong when he wanted to be weak. But he also thought about the promise, about the fact that God was with him, that God had chosen him, that somehow, impossibly, Joseph was going to be part of the greatest story that had ever been told. He thought about the words the angel had spoken. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. God with us. Not God in the temple, distant and untouchable, not God in the heavens, far away and unreachable. But God with us, God in our homes, God in our lives, God becoming human, becoming a child, becoming vulnerable and dependent and small. God choosing to need Joseph. As the night slowly gave way to dawn, Joseph sat by the window and waited for the sun to rise. And when it finally did, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, Joseph stood up and prepared himself to go to Mary. He had a message to deliver, a promise to make, a life to begin. He had to tell her that he believed. He had to tell her that he would take her as his wife. He had to tell her that he would be the earthly father of the Son of God. And as he stepped out of the workshop into the new day, Joseph felt something he hadn't felt in days. He felt hope. He felt purpose. He felt like a man who had been lost and had finally found his way home. He felt like a man who had said yes to God. Chapter 5, Bearing the Weight of the Promise. The village knew by afternoon. Joseph had found Mary at the well, where she went each morning to draw water. He'd waited until her mother had moved away to speak with another woman, and then he'd approached her, his heart hammering in his chest like a trapped bird. He'd taken her hand, a gesture that would have been scandalous just days ago, but which now felt like the most natural thing in the world. And he'd told her quietly, urgently, that he believed her, that the angel had come to him, that he would take her as his wife. Mary had wept, not tears of sorrow this time, but tears of relief, of joy, of a burden finally being shared. She'd squeezed his hand so tightly that it hurt, and she'd whispered his name like it was a prayer, and that had been enough for the village to know. By the time Joseph returned to his workshop, the whispers had already begun. He could see it in the way people looked at him as he passed, the quick glances, the conversations that stopped abruptly when he came near, the way mothers pulled their children closer, as though Joseph's sudden decision to claim Mary might somehow be contagious. He didn't care, or rather, he cared. He cared deeply about what people thought, about his reputation, about the shame that was about to descend on him like a heavy cloak. But he cared more about Mary. He cared more about the child. He cared more about the will of God than he cared about the judgment of men. That didn't make it easy. By evening, his father had come to the workshop. Joseph had been expecting it, had known that word would reach his father, that his father would want to understand what was happening, that there would be a conversation that Joseph wasn't looking forward to. His father was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of work and worry. He stood in the doorway of the workshop, silhouetted against the fading light, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at Joseph with an expression that was impossible to read. "Is it true, his father finally asked. "You're taking Mary as your wife, now? Before the proper time?" "Yes," Joseph said. He didn't elaborate, didn't try to explain, didn't offer excuses or justifications. His father stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The workshop grew dim. Joseph could barely see his father's face now, just the outline of him, the shape of his disappointment. "Do you understand what you're doing?" his father asked quietly. "Do you understand what people are going to say? What they're going to think?" "Yes," Joseph said again. "They're going to say that you've lain with her before marriage. They're going to say that you've brought shame on our family. They're going to say that you're a fool, or worse." "I know." His father was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Is she with child?" Joseph's throat tightened. He wanted to lie, wanted to protect Mary, to protect the secret that was still so new, so fragile. But he couldn't lie to his father. Not about this. "Yes," he said. He heard his father exhale slowly, heard the weight of that single word settle between them like a stone. "Then you're doing the right thing," his father said finally. "Whatever people say, whatever they think, you're doing the right thing by taking her as your wife. A man protects the woman he loves. A man takes responsibility for his actions. A man doesn't abandon a woman when she's carrying his child." Joseph wanted to correct him, wanted to explain that the child wasn't his, that Mary had been faithful, that there was a reason for all of this that transcended understanding. But he couldn't. The secret wasn't his to tell. It was Mary's secret, and the angel's secret, and God's secret. Joseph could only carry it in his heart and trust that someday, somehow, the truth would be revealed. "Thank you," Joseph said instead. His father nodded slowly. "We'll move the wedding forward. We'll do it quietly, without fanfare. We'll make it clear that this was always the plan, just accelerated. It won't stop the whispers, but it might soften them. It might make people think that perhaps there's a reason for the haste, rather than assuming the worst." "Thank you," Joseph said again. His father turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Joseph," he said, "I don't know what's happening here. I don't know why you've suddenly decided to claim this child as your own. But I know you. I know that you're a good man. I know that you wouldn't do this lightly. So I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust that you know what you're doing." And then he was gone, leaving Joseph alone in the darkening workshop. The wedding took place 3 days later. It was a small affair, nothing like the celebration that had been planned for months. No feast, no musicians, no dancing in the streets. Just the families, the rabbi, a few witnesses, and the quiet exchange of vows in the synagogue as the sun set. Mary wore a simple white tunic, her hair covered with a veil. She looked beautiful and terrified in equal measure. When Joseph took her hand, he could feel her trembling. He squeezed gently, trying to convey without words that he was there, that he believed her, that he would protect her. The rabbi performed the ceremony with a kind of knowing sadness, as though he understood perfectly well what was happening and had decided to be merciful about it. He didn't lecture Joseph about the importance of waiting until marriage. He didn't make pointed comments about the virtue of chastity. He simply performed the ceremony, pronounced them husband and wife, and blessed them with a gravity that suggested he understood that this marriage was about something far larger than the usual union of two families. When it was over, Joseph led Mary to the small house that his father had helped him prepare. The room he'd been building was finished now, the door frame installed, the walls plastered and whitewashed. It was simple, but it was theirs. It was a place to begin. Mary looked around the room with tears in her eyes. "You built this," she said softly, "before you knew, before you believed." "I built it for you," Joseph said. "I would have built it anyway." She turned to him, and in the lamplight he could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of the secret she'd been carrying, the fear that had been living in her heart since the angel came to her in Judea. "I'm so tired," she whispered. Joseph took her in his arms, and she rested her head against his chest. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding each other. And Joseph understood in that moment that this was what marriage was supposed to be. Not passion or romance or the kind of love that poets wrote about, but this, a man and a woman, standing together against the world, bearing each other's burdens, sharing each other's fears. This was love. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Joseph's life. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Women at the well would fall silent when Mary approached. Men in the marketplace would exchange knowing looks when Joseph passed. Children would point and giggle. The shame that Joseph had tried to soften by moving the wedding forward had only been delayed, not prevented. But worse than the whispers was the weight of the secret. Joseph carried it with him every moment of every day. When he was working, shaping wood, his hands would move through the familiar motions, while his mind was elsewhere, thinking about the child growing inside Mary. When he was eating, the food would taste like ash in his mouth, as he thought about what was coming, about the birth, about the responsibility that God had placed on his shoulders. He couldn't tell anyone, couldn't explain, couldn't defend himself or Mary against the accusations and the judgments. He could only endure it and trust that God knew the truth and hope that someday, somehow, it would all make sense. At night, he would lie beside Mary and listen to her breathing, and he would think about the child, about what it would mean to raise the Son of God, about the fact that somewhere inside Mary's body, God was growing, God was developing, God was preparing to enter the world as a human being, vulnerable and dependent and small. The thought was almost too much to bear. One night, about a month after the wedding, Joseph woke to find Mary crying silently beside him. He reached for her, and she turned to him, her face wet with tears. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Is the child... Are you in pain?" "No," she whispered. "I'm just... Joseph, I'm so afraid. What if I can't do this? What if I'm not strong enough? What if something goes wrong? What if..." Joseph pulled her close. "You're strong enough," he said. "You're the strongest person I know, and you're not alone. I'm here. I'm with you. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." "But you didn't choose this," Mary said. "You didn't choose to be part of this. The angel came to me, not to you. This is my burden, not yours." "It's both of ours now," Joseph said firmly. "When I took you as my wife, I took on everything that comes with you. The child, the secret, the shame, all of it. It's mine now too. You don't have to carry this alone." Mary wept against his chest, and Joseph held her, and he thought about the words the angel had spoken to him. "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife." He understood now why the angel had said that. Not because Joseph needed to be told that it was all right to marry her, but because Joseph needed to be told that it was all right to be afraid. That fear was natural, that doubt was natural, that the weight of this impossible task was something that would crush him if he tried to bear it alone. But he wasn't alone. Mary was with him, and God was with them both. As the months passed, Joseph began to understand what it meant to be the earthly father of the Son of God. It meant working harder than he'd ever worked before, taking on extra jobs, saving every denarius so that he could provide for Mary and the child. It meant enduring the whispers and the judgment without complaint. It meant preparing the house, making sure everything was ready for the birth. It meant learning to be patient with Mary's fears, her exhaustion, her moments of doubt. It meant praying, constantly, desperately praying. Joseph would work in his workshop shaping wood, and he would pray. He would pray for strength. He would pray for wisdom. He would pray for the ability to be the kind of father that this child deserved. He would pray for protection, for safety, for the child to be born healthy and whole. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when his hands were busy and his mind could settle, Joseph would feel a kind of peace, a sense that God was with him, that God had chosen him for a reason, that somehow, impossibly, Joseph was going to be equal to this task. One afternoon, as he was working on a plough, Joseph found himself thinking about the words the angel had spoken. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us, God with us. Not God in the temple, distant and untouchable, not God in the heavens, far away and unreachable, but God with us, God in Joseph's home, God in Joseph's life, God becoming human, becoming a child, becoming dependent on Joseph's care and protection. The thought was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Joseph set down his tools and walked to the window. Outside, the village was going about its business. People were working, talking, living their ordinary lives. They had no idea that something extraordinary was happening in their midst. They had no idea that God was about to enter the world in the most humble, most unexpected way possible. They had no idea that a carpenter in Nazareth had been chosen to be part of the greatest story that had ever been told. Joseph placed his hand on his chest over his heart, and he whispered a prayer of gratitude. Not for the ease of his situation. There was no ease in it. Not for the absence of fear or doubt. Those things were constant companions, but for the privilege, for the honour, for the fact that God had looked at him, a simple carpenter, and had said, "You are worthy, you are chosen, I trust you with my son." It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Chapter 6. The Road to Bethlehem. The decree came in the autumn, carried by Roman soldiers on horseback, read aloud in the marketplace by a man with a hard face and harder eyes. Caesar Augustus had ordered a census. Everyone was to return to the city of their ancestors to be registered. It was the law, it was not a request. Joseph heard about it from Eli the farmer, who'd been in the marketplace when the announcement was made. Eli had come to the workshop to pick up a repaired plough, and he'd mentioned it casually, as though it were just another piece of news, just another inconvenience in a life full of inconveniences. But Joseph had felt something shift inside him when he heard the words, Bethlehem, his ancestral city, the city of David, the city where, according to the prophecies that Joseph had read in the synagogue, the Messiah was supposed to be born. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, are only a small village among all the people of Judah. Yet a ruler of Israel will come from you, one whose origins are from the distant past. Micah 5:2 ESV. Joseph had read those words 100 times, had heard them read in the synagogue, had never imagined that they might apply to him, to Mary, to the child that Mary was carrying. But now, as he stood in his workshop with Eli's words echoing in his ears, Joseph understood. God was moving. God was orchestrating events. God was using the power of Rome itself to accomplish his purposes. The child would be born in Bethlehem, not because Joseph had planned it, but because Caesar had decreed it. Not because it was convenient, but because it was necessary. Not because Joseph understood how it would all work out, but because God had promised it, and God's promises were always fulfilled. That night, Joseph told Mary. She was sitting by the window, her hand resting on her swollen belly, watching the sun set over the hills. She was 7 months along now, her body heavy with the weight of the child, her face marked by the exhaustion of carrying something so precious, so impossible. We have to go to Bethlehem, Joseph said quietly, for the census. Caesar has ordered it. Mary turned to look at him, and he could see the understanding dawn in her eyes. She knew what it meant. She knew the prophecies as well as he did. When? She asked. Soon, within the month probably, before the roads become too difficult to travel. Mary placed both hands on her belly, cradling the child. The baby will come soon, she said. Maybe not for another month or two, but soon. What if the child comes while we're travelling? What if something goes wrong? Joseph sat down beside her and took her hand. I don't know, he said honestly. But God knows. God has promised that the child will be born in Bethlehem. So somehow we'll get there. Somehow it will all work out. But even as he said the words, Joseph wasn't sure he believed them. The journey began on a cold morning in late autumn. Joseph had prepared as best he could. He'd arranged for a donkey to carry Mary and their supplies. He'd packed food, bread, dried fruit, cheese, wine. He'd brought blankets and extra tunics. He'd made sure that Mary had everything she might need if the child came early. But nothing could have prepared him for what the journey would actually be like. Mary was exhausted within the first few hours. The donkey's gait, which seemed gentle enough when Joseph was walking beside it, was apparently excruciating when you were 7 months pregnant and trying to balance on its back. By midday, her face was pale with pain, and she was gripping the donkey's mane so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. We can stop, Joseph said, though they'd barely covered 10 miles. We can rest. No, Mary said, though her voice was strained. We need to keep going. We need to get there. So they kept going. The road to Bethlehem was crowded. Thousands of people were travelling, all heading to their ancestral cities to be registered. Families with children, old people, pregnant women, sick people. The road was a river of humanity, flowing slowly southward toward Jerusalem and beyond. Joseph tried to keep Mary away from the worst of the crowds, but it was impossible. They were swept up in it, carried along by the tide of people and animals and carts. Dust rose from the road in choking clouds. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Mary, sitting on the donkey, grew paler and more exhausted with each passing hour. On the second day, Joseph realized that Mary was in labor. It was subtle at first, just a tightening of her jaw, a slight intake of breath. But Joseph knew her well enough now to recognize the signs. He pulled the donkey to the side of the road and helped Mary down. How long? He asked. I don't know, Mary said, her voice tight with pain. Not long, I think. But Joseph, we're not in Bethlehem yet. We're still. I know, Joseph said. He looked around desperately, trying to figure out what to do. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by strangers, with no shelter and no help. Can you keep going? Can you make it to Bethlehem? Mary nodded, though her face was grey with pain. I have to, she said. The prophecy. I know, Joseph said again. He helped her back onto the donkey, and they continued on. The contractions grew worse as the day wore on. By evening, Mary was barely able to sit upright. Joseph had to support her with one hand, while leading the donkey with the other. She was breathing heavily, her face contorted with pain, her body rigid with the effort of holding back the birth that was coming. Joseph, she whispered. Joseph, I don't think I can. You can, he said, though he had no idea if it was true. You're the strongest person I know. You can do this. They pushed on through the night, Joseph walking beside the donkey, Mary clinging to its mane, both of them driven by a desperation that transcended exhaustion and pain. The road was dark, lit only by starlight. The crowds had thinned, most people having stopped to rest. It was just Joseph and Mary and the donkey, moving through the darkness toward a destination that seemed to recede with every step. By the time Bethlehem came into view, Mary was barely conscious. Joseph could see the lights of the town ahead, could see the outline of buildings against the pre-dawn sky. They were going to make it. Somehow, impossibly, they were going to make it. He quickened his pace, pulling the donkey forward, urging it to move faster. Mary made a sound, not quite a cry, not quite a moan, and Joseph knew that they were running out of time. Hold on, he said desperately. Just a little further, just a little. They entered the town as the first light of dawn was breaking over the hills. Joseph had never felt so helpless in his life. He'd gone from inn to inn, knocking on doors, asking for shelter, explaining that his wife was in labour and needed a place to stay. And at every door he'd been turned away. The town was full. The census had brought thousands of people to Bethlehem, and every room, every corner, every available space was already taken. Try the next town, one innkeeper had said, not unkindly, or find a cave. There are caves in the hills outside the town. Joseph had felt something like despair settle over him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Mary was supposed to have a proper bed, a midwife, clean water and cloths. The Son of God was supposed to be born in comfort, in safety, in a place of honour. Instead, he was going to be born in a cave. Joseph found a stable on the outskirts of town, a rough structure built into the side of a hill with a low roof and a dirt floor. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was private. It would have to be enough. He helped Mary inside, laid her down on the straw, and tried to remember everything he'd ever heard about childbirth, which was almost nothing. He was a carpenter, not a midwife. He had no idea what he was doing, but Mary did. It's all right, she said, gripping his hand as another contraction seized her. I know what to do. I've helped my mother with births before. Just stay with me. Don't leave me. I won't, Joseph promised. I'm here. I'm with you. And so he stayed, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, whispering words of encouragement that he wasn't sure she could hear. The labour was long and hard. Mary cried out with pain, her body straining, her will pushing against the limits of what a human body could endure. And Joseph, watching her, understood something that he'd never fully grasped before. He understood the cost of what Mary had agreed to. He understood the sacrifice she was making. He understood that she was literally giving her body, her strength, her very life to bring this child into the world. He understood that she was the bravest person he'd ever known. The child came as the sun was rising. Joseph caught him, a small, slippery, miraculous bundle of life. The baby was covered in blood and fluid, his skin dark red, his eyes closed. For a moment, Joseph was terrified that something was wrong, that the child wasn't breathing, that all of this had been for nothing. And then the baby cried. It was the most beautiful sound Joseph had ever heard. A small, indignant wail that echoed through the stable and seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. The child was alive. The child was healthy. The child was real. Joseph cleaned the baby as best he could with the water he'd brought, wrapping him in the clean cloths that Mary had prepared. The child's eyes opened, and for a moment Joseph found himself looking into the face of God. It was a baby's face, innocent, helpless, completely dependent on Joseph for survival. And yet Joseph could see something in those eyes that transcended the ordinary, a kind of ancient wisdom, a kind of knowing that seemed impossible in something so small. "Let me see him," Mary said weakly. Joseph brought the child to her, and Mary took him in her arms. She looked down at him with an expression of such love, such wonder, such fierce protectiveness, that Joseph felt his heart break and reform all at once. "Jesus," she whispered, speaking the name that the angel had given him. "My son, my beautiful son." Joseph stood beside them watching, and he understood that he was witnessing something sacred, something that would echo through eternity, the moment when God became human, the moment when the infinite became finite, the moment when the creator of all things became dependent on the care of a carpenter and a young girl. He thought about the journey, about the crowds and the dust and the pain, about the fact that Caesar's decree had brought them here, to this stable, at this exact moment, about the way that God had orchestrated everything, using the power of Rome itself to accomplish his purposes. Joseph understood now that nothing had been wasted. Every moment of suffering, every moment of fear, every moment of doubt, it had all been necessary. It had all been part of God's plan. He reached out and gently touched the baby's head. The child's skin was soft, impossibly soft. His hair was dark. His fingers were so small that they barely registered when Joseph placed his own finger in the baby's palm. "Hello," Joseph whispered. "I'm your father. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to teach you everything I know, I promise." The baby gripped Joseph's finger with surprising strength, and Joseph felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there. The doubt was still there. The weight of the responsibility was still crushing. But underneath all of that was something else. Something that felt like joy. Something that felt like purpose. Something that felt like love. Joseph was a father now. Not just in name, but in truth. Not just in the eyes of the law, but in his heart. This child, this impossible, miraculous, divine child, was his son. And Joseph would spend the rest of his life making sure that the world was worthy of him. Chapter 7. No room but a manger. The stable smelled of animals and straw and something earthy that Joseph couldn't quite name. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you question every decision that had led you to this moment. The roof leaked in one corner, and Joseph had spent the first hours after Jesus' birth trying to patch it with whatever materials he could find, working with numb fingers and a mind that felt like it was operating at a great distance from his body. Mary slept fitfully on a bed of straw that Joseph had arranged as carefully as he could manage. The baby, Jesus, his son, the Son of God, lay in a manger, wrapped in the cloths that Mary had prepared. It was the only thing in the stable that was even remotely suitable as a bed. Joseph had cleaned it thoroughly, lined it with fresh straw, and tried not to think about the fact that the Messiah, the one whom the prophets had spoken of for centuries, was sleeping in a feeding trough. Joseph sat on a low stool beside the manger, watching the baby sleep. He hadn't slept himself, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he was seized by a panic that something would go wrong, that the baby would stop breathing, that Mary would hemorrhage, that bandits would come, that soldiers would arrive, that somehow, impossibly, this fragile miracle would be taken from him. The rational part of his mind knew that these fears were excessive. The baby was breathing normally. Mary was resting peacefully. The stable was secure. There was no reason to expect disaster. But Joseph had learned over the past months that the rational part of his mind was not always reliable when it came to matters of faith and the impossible. He reached out and gently touched the baby's forehead. Jesus' skin was warm, his breathing steady and even. He was real. He was here. He was alive. Joseph felt something break open inside his chest. For months, he'd been carrying the weight of this secret, this impossible knowledge. He'd been enduring the whispers and the judgment and the shame. He'd been preparing himself for fatherhood, trying to imagine what it would be like to raise the Son of God. But none of it had felt entirely real until this moment. None of it had felt entirely true. But now, looking at this tiny, helpless child, Joseph understood that it was all real, all of it. The angel, the dream, the prophecies, the journey, the birth, all of it was real, and it was happening, and Joseph was part of it. He was the earthly father of Jesus Christ. The thought was so overwhelming that Joseph had to sit down, even though he was already sitting. He put his head in his hands and tried to breathe. What was he supposed to do with this? How was he supposed to be equal to this task? He was a carpenter. He knew how to shape wood, how to build things that were solid and true. But how did you raise the Son of God? How did you teach him? How did you protect him? How did you prepare him for whatever it was that God had planned for his life? Joseph didn't know, and the not knowing was almost as terrifying as the knowing had been. Mary woke as the sun was setting on the second day. She'd been sleeping almost constantly since the birth, her body exhausted from the labour, her mind needing the rest. But now she opened her eyes and looked around the stable with a kind of confused awareness, as though she wasn't quite sure where she was or how she'd gotten there. "Joseph," she called softly. He was at her side immediately. "I'm here. How are you feeling?" "Sore," she said, and then a small smile crossed her face. "But alive? And the baby?" "He's perfect," Joseph said. "He's sleeping. He's been sleeping most of the day. He seems healthy, strong." Mary nodded, and then her eyes filled with tears. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "During the labour, I was so afraid that something would go wrong, that I wouldn't be strong enough. That—" "You were strong enough," Joseph said firmly. "You were more than strong enough. You were incredible." He helped her sit up slowly, supporting her back with his arm. She winced with pain, but she didn't complain. Instead, she looked toward the manger, where Jesus lay sleeping. "Can I hold him?" she asked. Joseph carefully lifted the baby and placed him in Mary's arms. Jesus stirred slightly, his eyes opening for just a moment before closing again. Mary looked down at him with an expression of such tenderness, such fierce love, that Joseph had to look away. It was too much, it was too intimate, it was too sacred. "He's so small," Mary whispered, "so fragile. How is it possible that he's... "I know," Joseph said. He sat down beside her, and they sat together in silence, watching the baby sleep, both of them trying to process the reality of what had happened. "We should have been in a proper house," Joseph said finally, and there was bitterness in his voice that surprised him. "You should have had a midwife, clean water, a real bed. Not this." He gestured around the stable, at the rough stone walls, the dirt floor, the animals in the adjacent stalls. "Not this." "It doesn't matter," Mary said quietly. "It does matter," Joseph said. "He's the Son of God. He deserves better than this." "He deserves what God has given him," Mary said. She looked up at Joseph, and her eyes were clear, peaceful. God chose this. God chose this place, this time, this way. There's a reason for it, even if we don't understand it yet. Joseph wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the injustice of it, against the fact that the Messiah had been born in a stable, that he was sleeping in a manger, that the greatest event in human history was happening in obscurity and poverty and shame. But he couldn't, because Mary was right. God had chosen this, and if God had chosen it, then there was a reason, even if Joseph couldn't see it, even if it didn't make sense. On the third night, the shepherds came. Joseph was outside the stable, trying to repair the roof, when he heard them. Voices, excited and urgent, coming from the darkness. He climbed down from the roof, his heart suddenly racing. Bandits? Soldiers? Had someone discovered them? But when the figures emerged from the darkness, Joseph saw that they were just shepherds. Rough men, weathered by years of work in the fields, their clothes stained with dirt and animal waste. They looked almost wild, their eyes wide with something that might have been fear, or excitement, or both. "Is this the place?" one of them asked, his voice breathless. "Is the child here?" Joseph's hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Who are you? What do you want?" "We're shepherds," another one said. "We were in the fields, watching our flocks, and an angel appeared to us. He told us, he said there was a child born in Bethlehem, a Saviour who is Christ the Lord. He said we would find him wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Joseph's hand fell away from his knife. An angel, of course. God was still orchestrating things. God was still moving, still revealing, still making his purposes known. "Come now," Joseph said, and he led them into the stable. Mary was awake, sitting up on the straw, Jesus in her arms. When she saw the shepherds, she didn't look frightened. She looked almost as though she'd been expecting them. The shepherds approached slowly, reverently, as though they were walking on holy ground. They knelt beside the manger, and Joseph watched as they looked down at the baby with expressions of such awe, such wonder that he felt tears prick his eyes. "It's true," one of them whispered. "It's all true. The angel told us, and we didn't know if we could believe it, but it's true." "What did the angel tell you?" Mary asked gently. "That a Saviour has been born," the shepherd said. "That he will save his people from their sins. That his name is Jesus. That he is Christ the Lord." Joseph felt something shift inside him. The shepherds had been told the same thing that the angel had told him. The same promise, the same purpose. The child lying in the manger wasn't just Joseph's son, wasn't just Mary's son. He was the Saviour of the world. He was Christ the Lord. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. The shepherds stayed for a while, talking quietly with Mary, asking questions about the birth, marvelling at the baby. And then, as suddenly as they'd come, they left, disappearing back into the darkness, presumably to spread the news to others. When they were gone, Joseph sat down heavily on the stool beside the manger. "It's really happening," he said quietly. "It's all really happening." "Yes," Mary said. She was looking down at Jesus, who had woken during the shepherd's visit and was now looking around with the unfocused gaze of a newborn. "It's happening." "I don't know how to do this," Joseph said. The words came out before he could stop them. "I don't know how to be the father of the Saviour of the world. I'm just a carpenter. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. How can God ask me to do something like this?" Mary reached out and took his hand. "He's not asking you to save the world," she said. "He's asking you to be a father. He's asking you to feed him and clothe him and teach him and protect him. He's asking you to love him, that's all." "That's all," Joseph said, and there was something almost hysterical in his laugh. "Mary, that's everything. That's the most important thing anyone could ever do." "Yes," Mary said simply, "it is." Joseph looked down at the baby, at his son, at the child who would grow up to change the world, to save humanity, to fulfill the promises that God had made to his people centuries ago. And Joseph understood, in that moment, that Mary was right. His job wasn't to make Jesus into the Saviour. Jesus was already the Saviour. His job was simply to be a father, to provide, to protect, to love. It was the most important job in the world, and it was also the simplest. Joseph reached out and gently touched the baby's cheek. Jesus turned toward his hand, his mouth opening slightly, searching for food. Joseph smiled despite the tears that were streaming down his face. "I'll do my best," he whispered. "I promise you, I'll do my best." The days that followed were strange and disorienting. Joseph had expected that after the birth, things would settle into some kind of normalcy, but there was nothing normal about any of this. Mary was recovering slowly from the labour, her body weak and sore. The baby needed to be fed constantly, his cries echoing through the stable at all hours of the day and night. And Joseph was running on almost no sleep, trying to care for both of them, while also trying to figure out what came next. He'd registered with the census officials, claiming Jesus as his son. The officials had barely looked at him, had simply written down the information and moved on. To them, Joseph was just another man registering his family. They had no idea that they were recording the birth of the Messiah. Joseph had found work with a local builder, doing repairs and odd jobs to earn enough money to support his family. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy food and supplies, enough to keep them alive. But the stable was still their home, and Joseph still felt the weight of that injustice, even as he tried to accept it as part of God's plan. One evening, as he was sitting outside the stable watching the sunset, a man approached him. He was well dressed, clearly wealthy, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. "Are you the father of the child?" the man asked. Joseph's hand went to his knife again. "Who's asking?" "My name is Caspar," the man said. "I am a scholar and a traveller. I have come from the east, following a star. I believe that a great king has been born, and I have come to pay him homage." Joseph stared at him. "A star?" "Yes," Caspar said. "A star that appeared in the heavens some months ago. My colleagues and I have been following it, and it has led us here, to Bethlehem. We believe it marks the birth of a king who will change the world." Joseph felt something like awe settle over him. God was still revealing. God was still making his purposes known. Not just to shepherds in the fields, but to scholars and travellers from distant lands. "Come, Joseph said, and he led Caspar into the stable. Over the next few days, more visitors came. Caspar had brought 2 companions, Melchior and Balthazar, and they brought gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, treasures fit for a king. They knelt before the manger and worshipped the baby, and they spoke of the prophecies that had led them to this place, of the star that had guided them, of the certainty that they were in the presence of something divine. And Joseph, watching them, understood that the world was beginning to know, that the secret that he and Mary had been carrying was starting to be revealed, that the child lying in the manger was beginning to be recognized for who he truly was. But he also understood something else. He understood that with that recognition would come danger, that there were people in the world who would not welcome the birth of a king, that there were powers, both earthly and spiritual, that would oppose this child. And Joseph understood that it was his job to protect him, to keep him safe, to be the guardian of the one who would save the world. It was a burden almost too heavy to bear. But as Joseph looked down at his son, sleeping peacefully in the manger, he felt something settle inside him, a kind of resolve, a kind of determination, a kind of love so fierce and so absolute that he knew he would do anything, anything at all, to keep this child safe. He was a father now, and he would be the best father he could possibly be, even if it meant sacrificing everything, even if it meant living in a stable, even if it meant bearing the weight of the world's salvation on his shoulders. Joseph placed his hand gently on the baby's head and whispered a prayer of protection, and in the darkness of the stable, surrounded by the smell of animals and straw, Joseph made a silent vow. He would protect this child, he would raise him, he would teach him, he would love him with every fibre of his being. And when the time came, when the world was ready, when God's plan unfolded, Joseph would step back and let his son do what he had been born to do. But until then, Jesus was his, and Joseph would guard him with his life. Chapter 8. Dreams of Danger, a Father in Exile. The night the Magi left, Joseph couldn't sleep. He sat outside the stable, watching the stars wheel slowly across the sky, thinking about the gifts they'd brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, treasures that should have been used to build a palace, to establish a kingdom, to announce to the world that a great king had been born. Instead, they sat in a corner of the stable, wrapped in cloth, waiting for Joseph to figure out what to do with them. He'd accepted them graciously when the Magi had presented them, understanding that to refuse would have been an insult. But now, sitting alone in the darkness, Joseph felt the weight of them. They were too much, they were too grand. They didn't belong in a stable. They didn't belong in the life of a carpenter and his family. And yet they were here, just like everything else about this situation was here. Impossible, improbable, and utterly real. Joseph thought about the Magi's words as they'd knelt before the manger. They'd spoken of prophecies, of ancient texts that had predicted the birth of a king in Bethlehem. They'd spoken of the star that had guided them across deserts and mountains and vast stretches of unknown land. They'd spoken with absolute certainty that the child lying in the manger was the one they'd been seeking. It had been beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, because if the Magi knew, then others would know too. If a star had appeared in the heavens, then others would have seen it. If prophecies had been written about this child, then there were people who would be looking for him, people who might not come bearing gifts. Joseph thought about King Herod, who ruled Judea from Jerusalem. He'd heard stories about Herod, Stories of a man who was paranoid, cruel, willing to do anything to maintain his power. A man who saw threats everywhere, who eliminated anyone who might challenge his authority. What would Herod do if he learned that a child had been born who was being called a king? What would he do if he discovered that scholars from distant lands had come to pay homage to this child? Joseph didn't want to think about it, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He was still sitting outside the stable when Mary came to find him, just before dawn. She was moving slowly, carefully, her body still recovering from the birth. But she was moving, which was a good sign. She sat down beside him on the low stone wall that bordered the stable, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You're worried," Mary said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes, Joseph admitted. The Magi, they were kind and their gifts were generous. But Mary, if they know about Jesus, then others will know too. If a star appeared in the heavens, then people saw it. If prophecies have been written about him, then there are people who will be looking for him. "I know," Mary said quietly. "Herod," Joseph began, but Mary cut him off. "I know," she said again. "I've been thinking about it too. Ever since the Magi arrived, I've been thinking about what it means, about what might come." Joseph turned to look at her. In the pre-dawn darkness, her face was pale, almost ethereal. She looked exhausted and beautiful, and impossibly strong all at once. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Yes," Mary said simply. "I'm terrified. But Joseph, I've been afraid since the angel came to me in Judea. I've been afraid every day since then. And God has been with me through all of it. God has protected me. God has brought us here, to this place, at this time. I have to trust that God will continue to protect us." "But what if," Joseph started, but Mary took his hand. "What if God asks us to run?" she said. "What if God asks us to leave Bethlehem, to go somewhere else, to hide? Would you do it?" Joseph thought about the dream, about the angel Gabriel standing in his workshop, telling him to take Mary as his wife, about the absolute certainty he'd felt in that moment, the knowledge that God was real and present and in control. "Yes," he said, "if God asked me to, I would do it. I would take you and Jesus, and I would run to the ends of the earth, if that's what it took to keep you safe." "Then we don't need to be afraid," Mary said, "because God will guide us. God will tell us what to do. We just have to listen." Joseph wanted to believe her, wanted to have the kind of faith that could accept the impossible without question. But he was a carpenter, a practical man, a man who dealt in the tangible and the real. And the thought of having to flee, of having to leave everything behind, of having to live as a fugitive, it terrified him in a way that he couldn't quite articulate. But he didn't say that to Mary. Instead, he squeezed her hand and said, "You're right. We'll trust God. We'll listen for his guidance." That night, Joseph dreamed again. He was in the stable, but it was different from the real stable. The walls were made of light instead of stone. The manger glowed with a soft golden radiance, and standing beside the manger was the angel Gabriel, his presence filling the space with a kind of terrible beauty. "Joseph," the angel said, and his voice was like the sound of wind and thunder, and the singing of stars all at once. "You must take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Herod is seeking the child to destroy him. You must go tonight. You must not delay." Joseph woke gasping, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. For a moment he lay on the straw, trying to orient himself, trying to understand what he'd just experienced. Was it a dream? Was it real? Was it another visitation from the angel? Or was it just his own fears manifesting in his sleep? But he knew. He knew with the same absolute certainty that he'd felt when Gabriel had first come to him in Nazareth. This was real. This was God speaking to him. This was a warning and a command and a call to action. Joseph stood up, his movements urgent now, no longer slow and careful. He had to wake Mary. He had to prepare. He had to get them out of Bethlehem before dawn. Mary was sleeping beside Jesus, her arm draped protectively across the baby. Joseph knelt beside her and gently shook her awake. "We have to leave her," he said quietly. "Now. Tonight." Mary's eyes opened immediately, and Joseph could see that she understood. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply nodded and began to gather their things. They left Bethlehem in the darkness, just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Joseph had packed what he could: food, water, the clothes they would need. He'd wrapped the gifts from the Magi carefully and secured them to the donkey. He'd left money with the stable keeper to pay for the use of the space, though he knew the man would be confused when he discovered that they'd gone. Mary rode the donkey, Jesus cradled in her arms, wrapped in blankets to protect him from the cold. Joseph walked beside them, leading the donkey, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. They didn't speak. There was no time for words, no energy for anything, but the simple act of moving forward, of putting distance between themselves and Bethlehem, of following the path that Joseph had decided on in the darkness of the stable. Egypt. The angel had said Egypt. Joseph didn't know exactly where in Egypt they would go, didn't know how they would survive in a foreign land, didn't know how long they would have to stay, but he knew that they had to go. He knew that God had spoken, and Joseph had to obey. As they walked, Joseph thought about everything he was leaving behind. His workshop, his tools, his father, his home, the life he'd built in Nazareth, the reputation he'd worked so hard to establish, the community he'd been part of. All of it was gone now. All of it was being left behind. But as he looked at Mary, at the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, Joseph understood that none of it mattered. None of it was important compared to the safety of his family. None of it was worth the life of his son. He was a father now, and a father protected his child, no matter what the cost. They travelled for days, moving south and west, following the roads that led toward Egypt. Joseph had some money, the wages he'd earned from the builder in Bethlehem, plus the resources he'd brought from Nazareth. It was enough to buy food and shelter, enough to keep them moving, but not enough to last indefinitely. He would have to find work in Egypt, would have to establish himself in a new place, learn a new language, figure out how to survive in a land where he had no connections, no reputation, no one to help him. But he didn't think about that. He focused on the present moment, on the road ahead, on keeping Mary and Jesus safe. Mary was recovering well from the birth, though the travel was hard on her. The baby was healthy, nursing well, growing stronger with each passing day. Joseph found himself marvelling at the resilience of both of them, at the way they adapted to the hardship without complaint. One evening, as they were setting up camp beside the road, Mary said, "Tell me about Egypt. What do you know about it?" Joseph sat down beside her, watching as she nursed Jesus. "Not much," he admitted. "It's a great civilization, ancient, powerful. There are many cities there, many people. It will be easy to disappear, to start a new life without anyone knowing who we are or where we came from." "That's good," Mary said. "We need to disappear. We need to be safe." "We will be," Joseph said, and he tried to sound more confident than he felt. "God will protect us. God has brought us this far. God will see us through." Mary looked up at him, and in her eyes Joseph could see the same fear that he felt, but he could also see something else. A kind of peace, a kind of acceptance, a kind of faith that transcended understanding. "I know," she said. "I trust God, and I trust you." Joseph felt something shift inside his chest. The weight of the responsibility was still there, still crushing, still almost unbearable. But underneath it was something else now, a sense of purpose, a sense of rightness, a sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He was protecting his family, he was obeying God, he was being the father that Jesus needed him to be. It was enough. As they drew closer to Egypt, Joseph found himself thinking about the future. He didn't know how long they would have to stay. He didn't know when it would be safe to return to Judea. He didn't know what kind of life awaited them in this foreign land. But he knew that he would figure it out. He knew that he would work and provide and protect. He knew that he would teach Jesus everything he knew. How to work with his hands, how to be honest and true, how to live a righteous life. He knew that he would love his son with every fibre of his being. And he knew that someday, when the time was right, When God's plan unfolded, Jesus would do what he had been born to do. He would save his people from their sins. He would change the world. He would fulfill the promises that God had made to his people centuries ago. But until then, Jesus was just a baby, and Joseph was just a father, doing his best to keep his son safe, to raise him with love and care, to prepare him for the extraordinary life that lay ahead. Joseph looked down at Mary, at the baby nursing peacefully in her arms, and he made a silent vow. He would be the best father he could possibly be. He would sacrifice everything, if necessary. He would endure any hardship, face any danger, overcome any obstacle. Because this child, this impossible, miraculous, divine child, was his son. And Joseph would spend the rest of his life making sure that the world was worthy of him. Chapter 9. The Carpenter's Legacy. Years passed in Egypt, like water flowing through a stream, constant, inevitable, and somehow both endless and fleeting at the same time. Joseph found work quickly in Alexandria, using his skills as a carpenter to build furniture and repair homes for wealthy merchants and officials. He was good at his work, and word spread. Soon he had more jobs than he could handle, enough to support his family comfortably, enough to rent a small house with a workshop attached. It was a good life. Not the life he'd imagined for himself, but a good life nonetheless. Jesus grew. That was the thing that struck Joseph most forcefully. How quickly the child changed, how rapidly he developed from a helpless infant into a toddler, then into a boy. Joseph watched him learn to walk, to talk, to understand the world around him. He watched as Jesus' personality emerged, curious, thoughtful, kind, with a gentleness that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. Joseph taught him the things that a father teaches a son: how to hold a hammer, how to measure wood, how to plane a board until it was smooth and true, how to see the potential in a piece of timber, to understand what it could become if you worked with it patiently and carefully. Jesus was a quick learner. His small hands would grip the tools with surprising strength, and his eyes would focus intently on the work, as though he was trying to understand not just how to do it, but why it mattered. Joseph would stand beside him in the workshop, guiding his hands, explaining the principles of carpentry, and he would feel a kind of joy that he'd never experienced before. This was what it meant to be a father, not just to provide and protect, but to pass on knowledge, to teach, to shape the person that your child would become. Mary watched them work together, and Joseph could see the love in her eyes. She had adjusted to life in Egypt with remarkable grace, learning the language, making friends, creating a home. But Joseph knew that she missed Judea. He could see it in the way she would sometimes gaze toward the north, as though she could see across the distance to the land of her birth. "When will we go home?" she asked him one evening, as they sat on the roof of their house, watching the sun set over the city. "I don't know," Joseph said honestly. "The angel said to stay until Herod was dead, but I don't know when that will be. I don't know how to know." "We could send word," Mary suggested. "We could ask someone to find out. Someone travelling from Judea might know." Joseph nodded slowly. It was a good idea. He'd been waiting for some kind of sign, some kind of clear indication that it was safe to return. But perhaps God expected him to take action, to seek out information, to make a decision based on what he learned. It took several months, but eventually Joseph found a merchant who had recently come from Jerusalem. The man was staying in Alexandria for a few weeks, conducting business, and Joseph sought him out in the marketplace. "King Herod is dead," the merchant told him, after Joseph had carefully explained his situation, without revealing too much. "He died about a year ago. There was much celebration in Jerusalem. Many people saw his death as a blessing from God." Joseph felt something shift inside him. Herod was dead. The threat was gone. It was safe to return. That night, he told Mary. She wept, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of longing for the home she'd left behind so many years ago. "We can go home," she whispered. "We can finally go home." But Joseph hesitated. He'd built a life in Egypt. He had a successful business, a comfortable home, friends and connections. Jesus had grown up here. This was the only home the boy had ever known. What if it's not safe? Joseph asked. What if Herod's death doesn't change anything? What if his son is just as dangerous? Then we'll deal with it, Mary said. But Joseph, we can't stay here forever. This isn't our home. Judea is our home. Jesus needs to grow up in his own land, among his own people. He needs to know where he comes from. Joseph knew she was right. He'd always known that this was temporary, that Egypt was a refuge, not a destination. But knowing it intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. Still, he began to prepare. He sold his workshop to a younger carpenter who'd been working with him. He settled his accounts with his clients. He packed their belongings carefully, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. And then, one morning in early spring, they set out for home. The journey back to Judea was easier than the journey to Egypt had been. Joseph knew the roads now. He knew what to expect, and Jesus, who was old enough to understand what was happening, was excited about the adventure. "Will there be mountains?" the boy asked as they travelled. "Yes," Joseph said. "Great mountains, and deserts, and cities with walls so high that you have to crane your neck to see the top." "Will there be other carpenters?" Jesus asked. Joseph smiled. "Yes, many of them, but none as good as me." Jesus laughed, a sound like bells, and Joseph felt his heart swell with love for this child, who was his son in every way that mattered. They travelled slowly, taking their time, stopping to rest when Mary grew tired. And as they drew closer to Judea, Joseph found himself thinking about what awaited them, about the life they would build, about the future that stretched ahead of them. He didn't know what God had planned for Jesus. The angel had told him that the child would save his people from their sins. But Joseph didn't understand what that meant. How could a child save anyone? What did salvation even look like? But Joseph had learned over the years to trust in God's plan even when he didn't understand it. He'd learned to take things one day at a time, to do his best, to love his family with everything he had. That would have to be enough. They settled in Nazareth, in the house that Joseph's father had left to him. It was smaller than the house in Egypt, but it was home. Joseph rebuilt his workshop, re-established his reputation, began taking on clients again. The people of Nazareth welcomed him back, though they were curious about where he'd been and why he'd left so suddenly. Joseph told them a simple story, that he'd gone to Egypt to find work, that he'd done well there, but that he'd always wanted to return home. It was true enough, and it satisfied their curiosity. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, learning the ways of the village, attending the synagogue, becoming part of the community. He was a quiet child, thoughtful and observant, with a gentleness that made people want to be near him. Joseph watched as people were drawn to his son, as they seemed to sense something special about him, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. Joseph taught Jesus everything he knew about carpentry. The boy had a natural gift for it, an intuitive understanding of how wood worked, how to shape it, how to create something beautiful and functional from raw materials. But more than that, Jesus seemed to understand the deeper meaning of the work, the way that carpentry was about creating order from chaos, about taking something rough and making it smooth, about building things that would last. "Why do we do this?" Jesus asked one day, as he was helping Joseph build a table for a client. "Because people need tables," Joseph said, "because we can make something that will serve them, that will make their lives better." "But there are other carpenters," Jesus said. "Why does it matter if we do it?" Joseph set down his tools and looked at his son. The boy was 12 years old now, tall for his age, with eyes that seemed to see deeper than most people's eyes could see. "It matters because we do it well," Joseph said. "It matters because we do it with honesty and integrity. It matters because we care about the people we're serving. When you build something, you're not just making an object, you're making a promise. You're saying, I care about you enough to do this right. I care about you enough to use the best materials and the best techniques. I care about you enough to make something that will last." Jesus nodded slowly, as though he was absorbing not just the words but the meaning behind them. "That's important," he said finally. "Yes," Joseph said. "It is." Joseph was getting older now. His hands, which had been strong and sure for so many years, were beginning to show the signs of age. His back ached after long days of work. His eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be. But he kept working, kept teaching Jesus, kept building things, kept serving his community, kept living the life that God had given him. He thought sometimes about the angel's words, about the fact that Jesus would save his people from their sins. He thought about the Magi kneeling before the manger, speaking of a king. He thought about the prophecies that had been written about this child, centuries before he was born. And Joseph understood that he was just a small part of a much larger story, that his role was to be a father, to raise this child, to teach him, to love him, that someday Jesus would do something extraordinary, something that would change the world. But that day wasn't here yet. For now, Jesus was just a boy, and Joseph was just a father, doing his best to raise his son with love and care and integrity. One evening, as they were closing up the workshop, Jesus said, "Father, do you ever wonder what I'm supposed to do, what my purpose is?" Joseph looked at his son, this boy who was becoming a man, this child who carried within him the weight of the world's salvation, though he didn't yet fully understand it. "Sometimes," Joseph admitted, "but I've learned that worrying about the future doesn't change it. All we can do is live each day as best we can. We can be honest, we can be kind, we can work hard, we can love the people around us, and we can trust that God knows what he's doing." "Do you trust God?" Jesus asked. "Yes," Joseph said, "I do, even when I don't understand, even when I'm afraid. I trust that God has a plan, and that plan is good." Jesus nodded, and Joseph could see something shift in his son's eyes, a kind of acceptance, a kind of peace. "Then I will trust too," Jesus said. Joseph reached out and placed his hand on his son's shoulder, and in that moment Joseph understood that his work was almost complete. He had raised this child. He had taught him. He had loved him. He had prepared him, as much as any father could prepare a son, for the life that lay ahead. Soon Jesus would leave. Soon he would begin the work that God had called him to do. Soon the world would know who he was and what he had come to accomplish. But for now, in this moment, in this workshop in Nazareth, Joseph was simply a father with his son, and that was enough. That was everything. Joseph died on a quiet afternoon in spring, with Mary holding one hand and Jesus holding the other. He was an old man by then, his body worn out by years of work, his mind still sharp, but his strength finally failing. He'd lived a long life, longer than he'd expected to live when he was a young man in Nazareth, uncertain and afraid. As he lay dying, Joseph thought about everything that had happened. The angel's visitation, the journey to Bethlehem, the birth in the stable, the flight to Egypt, the years of building a life, of raising a son, of serving his community with honesty and integrity. He thought about the weight of the secret he'd carried, the knowledge that the child he was raising was the Son of God, the Saviour of the world. He thought about how that knowledge had shaped him, had challenged him, had ultimately made him a better man. "I did my best," he whispered to Jesus. "I hope it was enough." "It was more than enough," Jesus said, and there were tears streaming down his face. "You were the father I needed. You taught me everything I needed to know." Joseph smiled, and then he closed his eyes and he let go. The world would remember Jesus. The world would know his name, would tell his story, would build churches in his honour and write gospels about his life and death and resurrection. But the world would largely forget Joseph. He would be remembered as a carpenter, as a man who raised the Son of God, as a figure in the background of the greatest story ever told. But his own story, the story of his struggle, his faith, his sacrifice, his love, would fade into the background, overshadowed by the magnitude of his son's purpose. And yet, Joseph's legacy lived on in Jesus, in the way that Jesus understood the value of honest work, in the way that Jesus cared about people and wanted to serve them, in the way that Jesus trusted in God's plan, even when he didn't understand it. in the way that Jesus loved with a fierce, absolute, unconditional love. All of that came from Joseph. All of that was the gift that a carpenter from Nazareth had given to the world. Joseph had never been famous. He had never been powerful. He had never done anything that the world would consider great or extraordinary. But he had been faithful. He had been true. He had loved his family with everything he had. He had done his work with integrity and care. He had trusted in God, even when trust was difficult. And in doing those things, in being a good father, a good husband, a good man, Joseph had changed the world, because he had raised Jesus, and Jesus changed everything. The end.